We've looked before at some of the odder project ideas that came about as a result of the Cold War. Remote control cats, exploding seashells, and fungus-laced wetsuits. There have been some pretty fantastical, and to be honest, at the end of the day, quite funny projects that got proposed at least, if not actually enacted. But there were some other projects that went ahead that, in retrospect, seemed ludicrous, but were pursued at the time with deadly earnest. One of these included the secret stationing of nuclear missile field on an Allies territory in some of the most inhospitable territory on the planet. I'm your host David, and today we are going to revisit Greenland to examine Project Iceworm, missile silos built into a glacial ice sheet. This is the Cold War. So, by the early 1960s, the US Army had a problem. The Cold War nuclear arms race was heating up, and both the Air Force and the Navy had found their place in America's strategic arsenal. The Air Force had Strategic Air Command, and its nuclear bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles in hardened silos. The Navy had its Polaris submarines prowling beneath the oceans, capable of striking the Soviet Union from anywhere in the world. But the Army? Well, the Army was being left behind in the realm of strategic nuclear weapons. So it got creative, and it came up with one of the strangest plans of the Cold War, Project Iceworm. The idea was to build a sprawling network of tunnels under Greenland's Icecap, 4,000 kilometers of tunnels, and then hide 600 nuclear missiles beneath the snow and ice. These Icemen, as the missiles were nicknamed, would be moved constantly on underground rail lines, making them impossible for the Soviets to target. It was ambitious, it was secret, and to test it, the Army built a real underground city, Camp Century, the so-called City Under the Ice. But the experiment didn't last. The ice shifted, the tunnels sagged, and within a few years, the plan collapsed under the sheer weight of nature. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. The nuclear reactor that powered the city was removed, but most of the camp, including large amounts of diesel, sewage, and other toxic chemicals, was left behind, sealed under the snow. For decades, it seemed like a forgotten Cold War curiosity. But today, as Greenland's ice melts, Camp Century's secrets are threatening to re-emerge with potentially disastrous consequences. This means that the legacy of Project Iceworm is no longer just a story of Cold War ambition. It's about climate change, environmental risk, and the politics of cleaning up history's frozen mistakes. By the late 1950s into the early 60s, the nuclear arms race had turned into a frantic competition for survival. Both Washington and Moscow needed what strategists called a second strike capability. That's the ability to retaliate even after a surprise nuclear attack. You can find out more about that in our episode on nuclear deterrence theory if you're interested. But anyway, the Air Force had its long-range bombers like the B-52 and Atlas ICBMs. The Navy had its Polaris-capable missile boats. Both services were in the limelight. But the Army? Well, not so much. Its traditional role, defending or capturing territory with boots-on-the-ground troops, seemed irrelevant in a world of thermonuclear warheads. And in the world of budgetary pressures, this meant a smaller slice of the funding pie for the boys in green. Iceworm was born out of this inter-service rivalry. Greenland, therefore, sitting between North America and Eurasia, looked like the perfect opportunity to change this. Missiles launched from there could hit Moscow in under 20 minutes, and burying them under the ice would make them difficult to detect and almost impossible to destroy. But as anybody who cares about national sovereignty issues can tell you, there was one obvious obstacle. Greenland wasn't US territory. It belonged to Denmark, and Denmark had a strict no-nukes policy during peacetime. The 1951 Defense Agreement allowed the US to build bases in Greenland, including the SAC base at Thule, but said nothing about nuclear weapons. When US Ambassador Val Peterson asked in 1957 whether Denmark even wanted to be told about nuclear deployments, Prime Minister H.C. Hansen answered with studied vagueness. In a letter referring to, quote, supplies of munitions of a special kind, he wrote, I do not think that your remarks give rise to any comments from my side. In diplomatic language, that was as close to a wink and a nod as it got. The Americans took it as a tacit approval. Denmark could tell its public no nukes, while the US quietly prepared for the opposite. So when Camp Century was built in 1959, Copenhagen was told it was purely scientific. Newsreels showed happy soldiers drilling ice cores and living underground. The truth that it was also a test for a secret missile base was kept from both Danish voters and the Greenlandic people, who had already been displaced from their traditional homes for US military bases. When the documents came out in the 1990s, Danes were furious. Greenlanders were even angrier. Their land had nearly hosted a massive nuclear arsenal, and no one told them, let alone asked them. The Army Corps of Engineers chose a site about 240 kilometers inland from Thule, high on the Icecap at about 6,600 feet above sea level. The environment was brutal, with winds up to 200 kilometers per hour, winter temperatures of 60 degrees below zero, and a surface that was literally a slow-moving glacier. Supplies had to be dragged in by heavy swing tractors, crawling at 3 kilometers per hour in convoys that took nearly 3 days. In total, more than 6,000 tons of material were hauled across the ice. The construction itself was ingenious. Engineers cut trenches into the snow, roofed them with corrugated steel arches, and then reburied them. The result was a network of over 20 tunnels stretching over 3 kilometers. The main corridor, nicknamed Main Street, ran more than 300 meters long and was wide enough to drive vehicles through. Inside, they built a complete town. Barracks, a kitchen, a hospital, a movie theater, a chapel, a lab, and even a barber shop. Up to 200 men could live there in summer, and about 60 stayed through the long polar winter. The jewel of the facility was a portable nuclear reactor, a PM-2A portable reactor shipped in pieces and assembled under the ice. It provided 1.5 megawatts of electricity, making Camp Century the first nuclear-powered Arctic facility. Water came from a well drilled straight into the ice, producing almost 38,000 liters a day. The Army's publicity machine milked it for all it was worth. A documentary film in 1960 showed soldiers enjoying hot meals, watching movies, and going to chapel in their underground city. The narrator called it a city under the ice, a new concept in polar living. But behind the glossy PR, daily life was surreal and often grim. The men at Camp Century were volunteers, but they quickly discovered the place took a psychological toll. The tunnels were claustrophobic, the air smelled of diesel and oil, and the ice creaked ominously overhead. Soldiers described the unsettling experience of hearing the ice groan and crack as the tunnels shifted. One Danish observer stationed there wrote in his diary that they felt like voluntary captives in a frozen labyrinth, sleeping just a few hundred feet from a nuclear reactor. But the Army was committed to the idea of Camp Century, which spawned what should only be considered a publicity stunt. In an effort to humanize the camp, they invited 2 Boy Scouts, an American named Kent Goering and a Dane named Soren Gregersen, to spend time living with the soldiers. The boys became minor celebrities, their presence splashed across newspapers. For the soldiers, it was equal parts amusing and bizarre, sharing barracks and meals underground with teenagers brought in to prove how safe it all was. So, what was life at Camp Century like? Well, daily routines could be both monotonous and unnerving. Engineers remembered hacking away at tunnel walls with chainsaws to keep passages open as the ice slowly squeezed them shut. Others recalled movie nights in the rec hall, watching Hollywood films, while knowing that just outside, the ice was literally crushing the camp. Nuclear engineers had an especially tense job. In early 1961, news reached the camp that the SL-1 reactor in Idaho had exploded, killing 3 operators. The men at Camp Century were running a nearly experimental reactor under an ice sheet. As one officer later recalled, the thought of a similar accident stuck in the back of your mind every time you walked past the reactor vault. Camp Century was an American project, but we should also point out that not everyone was American. A Dane named Tuk Eriksen Jorgen Jensen, attached to the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, spent years shuttling between Thule and Camp Century. In a later interview, he described the strange double life of working alongside Americans underground, monitoring both the Soviets and his own allies, while trying to keep up the fiction that the camp was purely scientific. Camp Century might have been sold as a triumph of engineering, but to those who lived there, it was often unsettling, lonely, and faintly absurd. By 1962, the flaws in the plan were undeniable. The tunnels, supposed to last for decades, were already collapsing. Ceilings sagged, floors buckled, and the vault around the reactor had to be jacked up by 5 feet to keep it from being crushed. The Army had envisioned a missile base 3 times the size of Denmark. In reality, it was struggling to keep just a handful of tunnels open. Meanwhile, the Navy's Polaris submarines were demonstrating their effectiveness. They could hide anywhere in the oceans, were mobile, and didn't require constant maintenance in sub-zero conditions. By 1963, the Pentagon quietly killed Project Iceworm. Camp Century stayed open for a few more years as a token research station, drilling ice cores and running experiments, but its strategic purpose was gone. In 1967, it was abandoned. So that's the end of the story, right? Yes, except, well, no. When the Americans pulled out, they dismantled the reactor core and shipped it back to the United States, but almost everything else was left behind. Roughly 200,000 liters of diesel fuel remained, more than 60,000 gallons of sewage and reactor coolant were simply left in place. Unknown amounts of PCBs from machinery and building materials stayed behind as well, along with the collapsing remains of tunnels and wooden structures. At the time, this was considered perfectly safe. Greenland's snow would keep burying the site deeper each year. Officials assumed it would stay frozen forever, sealed by nature itself, so no cleanup was attempted. For decades, Camp Century faded into obscurity. By the 1980s, it lay buried under more than 100 feet of snow. But in the 21st century, climate change has begun rewriting that story. In 2016, scientists, using radar and climate models, warned that warming would eventually turn Camp Century's site from a zone of net snow accumulation into one of net melting. When that happens, the camp's debris field, covering about 136 acres, will begin to thaw. Among the materials waiting under the ice to be exposed, diesel, sewage, radioactive coolant, PCBs, and all the crumbling infrastructure. If released, they would contaminate the delicate Arctic ecosystem. PCBs in particular accumulate in food chains, posing risks to wildlife and indigenous communities. The assumption of the 1960s that the ice would keep everything sealed forever no longer holds. This then raises a thorny question: who is responsible for the cleanup? The United States built and operated Camp Century. Denmark technically allowed it, but had a no nukes policy, which the United States knowingly violated. Greenland, now largely self-governing, never consented to any of this, but will be the one to be directly affected if and when the pollution spreads. There's no treaty or precedent assigning liability for Cold War waste revealed by climate change. In 2018, Denmark and Greenland set aside funds for cleaning abandoned US bases, but Camp Century dwarfs the rest in scale. Washington has acknowledged the risk, but has avoided admitting liability. And for Greenlanders, the issue is about more than pollution. Their land was used without consent, their people were displaced, and now they may inherit a toxic legacy. Project Iceworm should be remembered as less of a triumph and more as a cautionary tale. Militarily, it shows how inter-service rivalry drove absurd schemes. The Army, desperate to prove it still had a role in the nuclear age, proposed and acted on a frankly wild idea. Politically, it exposed the costs of secrecy between allies. Denmark could tell its citizens no nukes, while the US quietly prepared otherwise. Decades later, that duplicity has damaged trust, threats of annexation aside. Environmentally, it has created a toxic time bomb that climate change may soon detonate. And yet, there is some silver lining to this story. The most enduring contribution of Camp Century wasn't its military impact, but rather in the field of science. The ice cores drilled there, forgotten for decades, revealed more than 100,000 years of climate history and has helped transform our understanding of Earth's climate. The camp, designed for nuclear war, has ended up contributing more to climate science than to defense. So Project Iceworm was never realized. No missiles ever slid along rails beneath Greenland's ice, but the attempt left behind Camp Century, a nuclear-powered city under the ice, abandoned and entombed. For the Army, it was meant to be a symbol of strength and ingenuity. Instead, it became a monument to Cold War hubris, secrecy, and the arrogance of believing nature could be bent to strategy. And now, the very thing that was supposed to keep Camp Century sealed forever, Greenland's ice, is melting away. What the Army left behind in silence may resurface in our lifetimes, leaking its diesel, sewage, toxic chemicals, and radioactive traces into a fragile Arctic ecosystem. It's a reminder that the Cold War did not end neatly in 1991. Its footprints are still with us, buried in the ground, lurking in archives, or frozen in ice. And as the years pass and the planet warms, those buried secrets are rising to the surface, demonstrating that the effects of the Cold War have a very long tail indeed. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is currently dragging a nuclear core across an ice sheet in order to power a secret base. This is something out of a Jack Kirby story. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.